For 6 weeks, she didn't speak. Not a whisper to her lawyer. Not a word to the judge. Not even a tear for her dead husband. Lydia Kincaid sat in the defendant's chair like a statue carved out of ice, watching the prosecution dismantle her life piece by piece. Everybody thought her silence was arrogance. The jury thought it was guilt. But they were all wrong. It wasn't until the final hour of the trial, when a junior prosecutor threw out one seemingly irrelevant question, that the ice finally cracked. And when the answer came, it didn't just decide the verdict. It rewrote the entire history of the crime. This is the story of the silence that screamed. The silence in courtroom 4B of the King County Superior Court wasn't peaceful. It was heavy. It felt like the air before a thunderstorm, thick with static and unsaid things. At the center of this atmospheric pressure sat Lydia Kincaid. To the 12 jurors sitting in the box, Lydia was an enigma wrapped in a charcoal gray suit. She was 42 years old, though the harsh fluorescent lights of the courtroom deepened the lines around her mouth, making her look older. Her husband, Robert Kincaid, a successful architect and a pillar of the Seattle community, was dead. He had been found 3 months prior, face down in the decorative koi pond of their sprawling mid-century modern home in Bellevue. The state's theory was simple, brutal, and compelling. They claimed Lydia, tired of Robert's controlling nature and hungry for his $5 million life insurance policy, had drugged his evening scotch with a lethal dose of diazepam and pushed him into the water to drown. It was a classic tale of greed and malice. But what made this trial a media circus wasn't the money or the murder. It was Lydia. From the moment Detective Miller slapped the handcuffs on her wrists on that rainy Tuesday in November, Lydia had uttered exactly 0 words. She hadn't asked for a lawyer. She hadn't proclaimed her innocence. She hadn't asked about her children, Leo and Sarah, who were currently staying with Robert's sister. During the arraignment, she stood mute. The judge, confused, had to enter a plea of not guilty on her behalf. Now, 3 weeks into the trial, her defense attorney, Arthur Penhaligon, looked like a man trying to bail out the Titanic with a teaspoon. Arthur was a legend in Washington state, a man who could charm a verdict out of a stone, but Lydia was giving him nothing. No alibi, no explanation, no emotion. "She's a cold one, isn't she?" whispered a reporter from the Seattle Times in the gallery. "Ice water in her veins," replied his colleague. "Look at her. She's watching the medical examiner describe her husband's lungs filling with water, and she hasn't even blinked." Dr. Aris Thorne, the medical examiner, was on the stand, projecting gruesome autopsy photos onto the screens. "The toxicity levels suggest Mr. Kincaid was incapacitated within 20 minutes of ingestion," Thorne explained, his voice dry. "He would have been unable to coordinate his limbs. If he fell into the water, he wouldn't have been able to stand up." District Attorney Sylvia Ross, a shark in a navy blazer, paced in front of the jury. "So, Dr. Thorne, this wasn't an accident? He didn't just slip?" "Highly unlikely given the bruising on the upper shoulders. Consistent with a shove," Thorne confirmed. DA Ross turned to the jury, her eyes landing briefly on Lydia. "A shove, by someone who was there, someone who made him the drink." Arthur Penhaligon shifted in his seat. He leaned over to Lydia, whispering urgently, "Lydia, please, if you don't give me something to work with, Ross is going to bury us. Just tell me, did you make the drink?" Lydia didn't turn her head. Her eyes were fixed on the photo of her husband's pale hand floating in the dark water. Her chest rose and fell in a steady, terrifying rhythm. She said nothing. Arthur sighed, rubbing his temples. He had defended mobsters, arsonists, and thieves. He had never been this terrified. Because in his gut, Arthur knew something was wrong. Not "my client is guilty" wrong, but the world is looking at the wrong picture wrong. He just didn't know what it was. The silence was her shield. But shields can be broken. To understand the silence, you have to understand the noise that came before it. 6 months before the trial, the Kincaids were the envy of the Pacific Northwest. Robert "Rob" Kincaid was the kind of man who sucked the oxygen out of a room. Charismatic, loud, brilliant. He designed eco-friendly skyscrapers that won international awards. He was the guy buying rounds of drinks at the country club, the dad coaching Leo's soccer team, the husband buying Lydia diamonds for no occasion. Lydia was his anchor. A former librarian, she was soft-spoken, intelligent, and fiercely private. While Rob loved the spotlight, Lydia preferred the shadows. She managed the house, the finances, and the children with military precision. They were perfect, testified their neighbor, Brenda Walsh, on day 4 of the trial. Brenda was a nervous woman who clutched her handbag like a lifeline. Rob was always laughing. He called Lydia his queen. I never heard them fight. Not once. Never? D.A. Ross pressed, raising an eyebrow. In 10 years of living next door. Well, Brenda hesitated. You know how it is. Sometimes you sense tension. But shouting, no. Rob was... He was a good man, Ross repeated. And yet the prosecution has entered into evidence bank statements showing that 2 days before his death, Robert Kincaid emptied their joint savings account. $300,000 transferred to an offshore holding. The jury murmured. This was the first crack in the facade. Ross continued. Mrs. Walsh, did Lydia ever mention money troubles to you? No. Brenda shook her head. Lydia didn't talk about problems. She just fixed things. She fixed things, Ross echoed ominously. The narrative Ross was painting was clear. Rob was planning to leave or hide money, Lydia found out. And she fixed the problem. But the defense, crippled by Lydia's silence, had to rely on a different strategy. Character witness assassination. Arthur Penhaligon stood up to cross-examine Brenda. Mrs. Walsh, Arthur began, his voice honey-smooth. You say Rob was a good man. Did you know he had a second phone? Brenda blinked. No. Did you know, Arthur continued, holding up a document, that Robert Kincaid had been fired from his firm 3 weeks before his death for embezzlement, a fact he hid from everyone, including his wife. The courtroom gasped. Lydia didn't move. She didn't look shocked. She didn't look vindicated. She just stared at the wood grain of the defense table. Objection! Ross shouted. Relevance? The relevance, Your Honor, Arthur boomed, is that the victim was a man living a double life, a man with enemies, a man desperate for cash. The prosecution wants you to believe his wife killed him for insurance money, yet he had just stolen $300,000 and vanished it. Maybe the question isn't what Lydia did. Maybe the question is, where is the money? It was a brilliant pivot. Arthur was trying to introduce reasonable doubt by suggesting a drug deal gone wrong or a debt collection. But every time Arthur scored a point, Lydia's silence dragged them back down. The jury looked at her and saw a void. Humans are hardwired to look for reactions. If you accuse someone of murder, they should scream. If you mention their dead husband's secrets, they should cry. Lydia's lack of reaction was being read as the ultimate sign of a sociopath. The turning point of the first week came when the prosecution called Leo Kincaid, the couple's 16-year-old son, to the stand. The courtroom doors opened, and a lanky boy with messy hair walked in. He looked like a younger, more broken version of his father. He avoided looking at the defense table. He wouldn't look at his mother. Lydia, for the first time, shifted. Her hand twitched on the table. Arthur saw it. A tiny crack in the ice. Leo, D.A. Ross said gently, I know this is hard. Can you tell the jury what happened on the night of August 14th? Leo swallowed hard. I came home from practice around 8 p.m. Dad was in the den. He was drinking. Was your mother there? Yes, she was in the kitchen. She was grinding herbs for tea or something. Did you hear them talking? Leo looked down at his sneakers. Dad was yelling. He was saying... He said, It's over, Lyd. I can't do it anymore. I'm telling them. Telling who, Leo? I don't know. He just said, I'm telling them everything. And what did your mother say? The courtroom held its breath. Leo looked up, tears streaming down his face. She said, "If you do that, you destroy this family." D.A. Ross let the words hang in the air. And then what happened? I went to my room, put on my headphones. I fell asleep. When I woke up, the police were there. Ross nodded solemnly. "Thank you, Leo. It was damning. Motive, opportunity, a threat. You destroy this family." Arthur Penhaligon stood up slowly. He knew he had to tread carefully. This was his client's son. "Leo," Arthur said softly, "you said your dad was yelling. Was he drunk?" "I think so. He slurred a lot. You said your mum was grinding herbs. Did you see her put anything in his drink?" "No." "Did you see her go into the den?" "No." Arthur paused. He needed to ask one more question, a risky one. "Leo, do you love your mother?" Leo's head snapped up. He looked directly at Lydia then. For 5 agonizing seconds, mother and son locked eyes. Lydia's face remained a mask, but her eyes were screaming something silent, something desperate. Leo's voice broke. "I don't know who she is anymore." Lydia closed her eyes. It was the only emotion she had shown in 20 days. As Leo stepped down, the jury was glaring at Lydia. A mother who loses her son's love so completely must be a monster. But Arthur Penhaligon was looking at his notes. There was a timeline discrepancy. Leo said he came home at 8 p.m. The medical examiner said death occurred between 9 and 10 p.m. But the alarm system logs, which Arthur had just received that morning, showed the back door opening at 9:15 p.m. Someone else had been in that house. Arthur leaned over to Lydia. "Lydia, the back door. Who opened the back door at 9:15? Lydia opened her eyes. She picked up a pen, hovered it over a notepad, and then, with a trembling hand, put the pen down. She knew. Arthur realized with a jolt of horror that she knew exactly who walked through that door, and she was willing to die in prison to keep that name out of the record. The revelation of the security logs changed the atmosphere in Arthur Penhaligon's office from despair to frantic energy. It was 2 a.m. Pizza boxes were stacked on the conference table, and the smell of stale coffee hung in the air. 9:15 p.m., Arthur muttered, staring at the whiteboard. Leo is in his room with headphones on. Rob is drunk in the den. Lydia is in the kitchen. And then, the back door sensor trips. "Maybe Lydia opened it to get fresh air," suggested paralegal Sarah Jenkins. "In the rain? Without a coat?" Arthur shook his head. "No, the motion sensor on the back patio light didn't trigger outgoing movement. It triggered incoming movement. Someone walked in. Someone who knew the code, because the alarm didn't sound." Arthur grabbed his coat. "I need to see her. Now." Technically, visiting a client at the King County Jail at 3 a.m. was impossible, but Arthur knew the night warden, a man named Higgins, who owed Arthur a favor from a DUI case involving his nephew years ago. 30 minutes later, Arthur sat across from Lydia in a cold, concrete interview room. She looked smaller in the orange jumpsuit, her hair pulled back in a severe bun. She looked exhausted. "Lydia," Arthur said, sliding the security log across the metal table. "Look at it." Lydia didn't look. 9:15 p.m., Arthur pressed. "Someone entered your house. The alarm wasn't forced. They punched in the code. That means it was family, or someone close enough to be family." Lydia's eyes flickered, a tiny, imperceptible tightening of the jaw. "Rob was dead by 10, Arthur continued, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Whoever walked in that door is the real killer, or they saw who did it. Why are you protecting them?" Lydia stared at the wall. "Is it Leo?" Arthur asked. "Did Leo come back downstairs?" Lydia's head snapped toward him. Her eyes were blazing. For a second, Arthur thought she would leap across the table. She shook her head violently, her breathing ragged. "Then who?" Arthur slammed his hand on the table. "Lydia, I can't save you if you don't give me a name. Was it a lover? Was it Rob's business partner? Was it Veronica?" He threw the name out as a bluff. He had found the name Veronica scrawled on a napkin in Rob's wallet among the evidence files. Lydia froze. The colour drained from her face, leaving her ghostly pale. She reached for the notepad Arthur always brought. Her hand shook so hard the pen tore the paper. She wrote one word, underlined it 3 times, and shoved it at him. No. She then wrote a second sentence, slower this time. The question isn't who came in. The question is who never left. Arthur stared at the cryptic note. Who never left? What does that mean? But Lydia Kincaid had returned to her statue state. She folded her hands, closed her eyes, and the steel door of her silence slammed shut once more. Arthur left the jail more confused than when he arrived. Who never left? It sounded like a riddle. But as he drove back through the rainy Seattle streets, a thought struck him. The house was a mid-century modern. It had a basement that wasn't included in the main floor plans due to a renovation in the 90s. He pulled over and dialed his private investigator, a former cop named Mike Vance. "Mike, wake up," Arthur barked. "I need you to find out everything about the construction contractors who worked on the Kincaid house 2 years ago, specifically anyone named Veronica. And Mike, check the basement." The following week, the trial resumed with a vengeance. The media frenzy had reached a fever pitch. #Silent Lydia was trending on Twitter. Armchair detectives analyzed her facial micro-expressions. DA Sylvia Ross was ready to drive the final nail into the coffin. "The people call Dr. Eleanor Vance, psychiatrist," Ross announced. A stern woman with glasses took the stand. She had treated Rob for anxiety 6 months prior. "Dr. Vance," Ross began, "did Robert Kincaid ever express fear of his wife?" "Objection," Arthur stood up. "Doctor-patient privilege." "The patient is deceased, Your Honor," Ross countered, "and the privilege is waived when the safety of the patient was at risk." Judge Harriet Moore adjusted her glasses. "Overruled. You may answer." Dr. Vance nodded. "Mr. Kincaid told me that Lydia had become detached. He said she would stand in the room and watch him for hours without speaking. He called it predatory stillness. He was terrified she was poisoning him slowly." The jury looked at Lydia. She was doing exactly what the doctor described, sitting in predatory stillness. "He told me," Dr. Vance continued, "that he found a bottle of diazepam in her knitting bag. He didn't have a prescription. Neither did she. But he found it." Ross walked to the evidence table and picked up a small orange bottle in an evidence bag. "People's Exhibit 4A," Ross said, holding it up for the jury. "Recovered from the bottom of the trash compactor in the Kincaid kitchen. The label is scraped off, but the fingerprints on the cap belong to one person, Lydia Kincaid." The courtroom buzzed. This was the murder weapon. "Lydia Kincaid bought the drugs," Ross said, turning to the jury. "Lydia Kincaid hid the drugs. Lydia Kincaid used the drugs to incapacitate her husband, dragged his paralyzed body to the pond, and pushed him in. And she has the audacity to sit here in silence and mock this court. The prosecution rests," Ross declared, slamming her file shut. It looked like checkmate. The jury looked ready to convict right then and there. Arthur Penhaligon stood up. His suit was rumpled. He hadn't slept in 2 days. He walked to the center of the room. "Your Honor, the defense calls Detective Mark Miller to the stand." Detective Miller, the lead investigator, looked annoyed to be recalled. He was a burly man who had already testified that this was an open and shut domestic homicide. "Detective," Arthur began, pacing, "you found the diazepam bottle in the trash compactor, correct?" "Yes." "And you found Lydia's prints on it?" "Yes." "Did you find anyone else's prints?" "No." "Interesting," Arthur said, "because Leo Kincaid testified that he took the trash out that night. Yet his prints weren't on the bag or the items. He likely wore gloves or held the bag by the ties." Miller shrugged. "Or," Arthur said, "the trash wasn't taken out by Leo. Detective, did you investigate the crawl space access in the Kincaid basement?" Miller frowned. "The crawl space? No, it wasn't relevant to the crime scene." Not relevant? Arthur pulled a photo from his jacket pocket. It was a grainy picture Mike Vance had taken just hours ago, after legally breaking into the sealed crime scene. This is a photo of the crawl space door. Can you tell the jury what is scratched into the wood next to the handle? Miller squinted at the projection screen. It looks like initials. Read them, please. VM. VM? Arthur repeated. Does the name Veronica Moore mean anything to you, Detective? The DA stood up. Objection. Who is Veronica Moore? I'm glad you asked, Arthur smiled, though his eyes were cold. Veronica Moore is Robert Kincaid's illegitimate daughter. She is 22 years old. She has a history of drug addiction, specifically diazepam addiction. The silence in the courtroom shattered. Reporters began typing furiously. Lydia didn't move, but a single tear finally escaped, rolling down her cheek. Detective, Arthur raised his voice over the noise. Did you know that Veronica Moore was released from rehab 3 days before the murder? Did you know her phone pinged off the tower nearest the Kincaid house at 9:15 p.m. that night? The exact time the back door opened? Miller looked stunned. We didn't know he had a daughter. Of course not, Arthur said, because Lydia Kincaid scrubbed her existence from the records to protect her husband's reputation. She paid for the rehab. She paid for the apartment. Arthur turned to the jury. The prosecution told you Lydia was silent because she was guilty. I tell you she was silent because she was a mother, a stepmother, keeping a promise to a dead man to protect a troubled girl who she thought, wrongly, had killed her father. Arthur leaned on the railing. But here is the twist, Detective. Veronica Moore didn't kill him. We found her. She's in the hallway. The doors swung open. A young woman, looking terrified and ragged, stood there escorted by Mike Vance. She looked exactly like Rob Kincaid. She came at 9:15, Arthur said softly. She asked for money. Rob gave it to her, and then she left at 9:30. Alive. Rob was still alive. So if Lydia didn't do it, Arthur whispered, turning back to the detective, and Veronica didn't do it, and Leo was in his room, then who killed Robert Kincaid? The courtroom was dead silent. The theory of the silent killer had just been inverted. Lydia wasn't hiding her crime. She was hiding the shame of her husband's secret family. But Arthur knew this wasn't enough. He had proven Lydia was protecting Veronica. He hadn't proven who the killer was, and that was when the junior prosecutor, a young man named Daniel Thorne, no relation to the medical examiner, stood up. He had been quiet the whole trial, organizing files for Sylvia Ross. Your Honor, Daniel said, his voice shaking slightly. The prosecution would like to recall a witness. Sylvia Ross looked at her junior associate like he had lost his mind. Daniel, what are you doing? She hissed. I have a question, Daniel said, staring at the defense table. One question for the defendant. Judge Moore looked intrigued. You want to call the defendant? She has the right to remain silent. I don't want to call her to the stand, Daniel said. I want to ask her to write something down. Arthur looked at Lydia. She gave a microscopic nod. We allow it, Arthur said. Daniel Thorne walked to the center of the room. He didn't look at the jury. He looked straight at Lydia. Mrs. Kincaid, Daniel said, we know about Veronica now. We know about the money. But there is one thing missing from the timeline. The medical examiner found traces of a specific herbal compound in your husband's stomach. Wolfsbane. The room gasped. It's an old poison, Daniel said. Rare. Hard to find. But it grows in one place in Seattle, the Botanical Gardens, where you volunteered. Arthur froze. He didn't know this. My question is this, Daniel said, holding up a piece of paper. This is a receipt for wolfsbane seeds, dated 6 months ago, signed by L. Kincaid. Is this your signature? Arthur felt the blood drain from his face. If she signed it, she was done. Lydia looked at the paper. She looked at Daniel, And then, for the first time in 6 weeks, Lydia Kincaid opened her mouth. Her voice was raspy, unused, like dry leaves skittering on pavement. "No," she croaked. The sound was electric. "That is not my signature." "Then whose is it?" Daniel pressed. Lydia looked up, her eyes locking not on the lawyer, but on someone sitting in the back row of the gallery, someone who had been crying quietly for the entire trial. "It belongs," Lydia said, her voice gaining strength, "to the person who knew where the spare key was. The person who knew Rob was allergic to diazepam and needed something stronger. The person who was in love with him." She raised a finger and pointed. "Ask Brenda." The moment Lydia Kincaid's voice cut through the air, the courtroom didn't just go silent. It froze. It was as if a spell had been broken. The Ice Queen had spoken. "Ask Brenda," Lydia had rasped, her finger pointing like a spear at the third row of the gallery. Brenda Walsh, the nervous neighbor who had testified about the Kincaids' perfect marriage, turned a shade of grey usually reserved for corpses. She clutched her handbag to her chest, her eyes darting between the exit signs. "Order!" Judge Moore banged her gavel, the sound cracking like a pistol shot. "Order in this court!" Arthur Penhaligon didn't hesitate. He saw the panic in Brenda's eyes. He saw the guilt. "Your Honor," he shouted over the rising murmur of the crowd, "the defense moves to recall Brenda Walsh to the stand immediately. She is still under subpoena." DA Sylvia Ross looked like she had been slapped. Her star witness was being accused by the defendant. She started to object, but she looked at the receipt in Daniel Thorne's hand, the Wolfsbane receipt, and then at Brenda's trembling form. Sylvia was a prosecutor, but she was an officer of the court first. She saw it too. "No objection," Ross said quietly. "Mrs. Walsh," Judge Moore said, her voice steel, "take the stand." Brenda shook her head frantically. I have to pick up my kids. I can't." "Bailiff," the judge barked. 2 officers stepped toward Brenda. With a whimper, she stood up and shuffled towards the witness box. She looked small, frail, and terrified. But as she passed the defense table, she didn't look at Lydia. She looked at the empty spot where Rob used to sit. Arthur approached the stand. He felt a surge of adrenaline. This was it. The Hail Mary. "Mrs. Walsh," Arthur began, his voice dangerously low. "You testified that you never heard Rob and Lydia fight. You said they were perfect." They were," Brenda stammered. "You also said you were home all night on August 14th watching TV," Arthur said, pacing. "Is that true?" "Yes. The Bachelor was on." Arthur stopped. He turned to the projection screen where the Wolfsbane receipt was still displayed. This receipt is dated June 12th. It's from Seattle Rare Botanicals. The signature reads L. Kincaid, but looking closely, Arthur zoomed in on the signature. The L loops backward. Lydia's L loops forward. We have her marriage license here to compare. He flashed the marriage license next to the receipt. The difference was obvious. "Who signed this, Brenda?" Arthur asked. "I don't know. Maybe she changed her handwriting," Brenda cried, her voice shrill. "Did you know," Arthur continued, ignoring her outburst, "that Robert Kincaid was allergic to diazepam? That's why he had no prescription. That's why Lydia never kept it in the house. But Wolfsbane, that's different. It mimics heart failure. It mimics drowning. It's a gardener's poison." Arthur leaned in close. "Lydia didn't buy those seeds, Brenda. But you're a gardener too, aren't you? You won the Bellevue Garden Club Award 3 years in a row." Brenda's lip quivered. "So what? Lots of people garden." "True," Arthur said, "but not lots of people were having an affair with Robert Kincaid." The gasp from the gallery sucked the air out of the room. Even Lydia looked shocked. "Objection," Ross shouted, though half-heartedly. "Basis?" "The basis," Arthur said, pulling a new document from his folder, a paper Mike Vance had texted him only minutes ago, "is the phone records from Robert's second phone, the burner phone, the one we thought he used for business." Arthur held up the log. Hundreds of calls. To one number. Yours, Brenda. Brenda closed her eyes. The tears began to flow, ruining her mascara, turning her face into a tragic mask. He told you he was leaving her, didn't he? Arthur pressed, his voice rising. He told you he had embezzled the money. He told you he was running away. Brenda nodded, a jerk of the head. And you thought he was running away with you, Arthur said. Didn't you? Brenda looked up, her eyes filled with a terrifying mix of love and hate. He said I was the only one who understood him, she whispered. He said Lydia was cold. He said she was a statue. But on the night of August 14th, Arthur said, you went over there. You used the spare key under the planter, the one only the neighbor would know about. You went in through the back door. But wait. Arthur paused. He looked at the timeline. Veronica came at 9:15. You must have been there before. Or after? I was in the basement, Brenda blurted out. The courtroom fell silent. I was waiting for him, she sobbed. I brought the tea. I made it with the herbs I grew. I wanted to celebrate. He told me that afternoon he had the money. He was leaving that night. So you waited in the basement, Arthur said, and you heard him arguing with Veronica? I heard him tell that girl, Brenda's voice hardened. I heard him tell her, I'm leaving everyone. Lydia, the kids, everyone. I'm going to start fresh in Costa Rica, alone. Brenda's hands clenched into fists on her lap. Alone. He lied to me. He used me to hide the cash. He used me for comfort. And he was going to leave me behind like I was nothing. Arthur stood back. The motive was clear. The scorned woman. So when Veronica left, Arthur said softly, he went upstairs. He was drunk, Brenda said. Her voice detached now, as if describing a movie. He thought I was Lydia at first. He told me to get out. I told him I made him tea, to calm his nerves. And he drank it? He drank it all. And then? Then he started to stumble. He got scared. He went to the patio for air. He fell. Brenda looked at her hands. I didn't push him. The wolfsbane. It makes your muscles stop. He just tipped over, into the water. And you watched him drown, Arthur said. It wasn't a question. I watched him leave, Brenda corrected, her voice chillingly devoid of regret. He said he was leaving, so I let him go. The confession hung in the air like smoke. Brenda Walsh was weeping into her hands. The jury looked stunned. DA Sylvia Ross was already signaling her team to draft arrest warrants. But Arthur Penhaligon wasn't done. He turned back to his client. Lydia was sitting straight, her eyes wet. She wasn't looking at Brenda. She was looking at Leo, her son, in the front row. Leo had his hands over his mouth, sobbing quietly. Arthur walked back to the defense table and sat down heavily. He leaned over to Lydia. The microphone was off, but the courtroom was so quiet, the front row could hear him. Lydia, Arthur whispered, you knew about the affair? Lydia nodded slowly. I knew he was cheating. I didn't know it was her. I didn't care anymore. Then why? Arthur asked, the question that had plagued him for 6 weeks. Why did you stay silent? Why did you almost let yourself go to prison for life? You knew you didn't do it. You knew Veronica didn't do it. Why take the fall? Lydia turned to him. The Ice Queen facade was gone. In its place was a mother, tired and broken. Because of the tea, she whispered. Arthur frowned. The tea? When I came downstairs that night, Lydia said, her voice gaining a little strength, enough for the jury to hear. I saw Rob in the pond. He was already gone. She took a breath. I went into the kitchen to call 911, and I saw the mug on the counter. It was Rob's favorite mug, and inside, there were herbs. Lydia looked at Leo. I taught Leo how to make tea, she said, her voice cracking. I taught him about herbs. He was so angry at his father. He heard us fighting every night. He told me once he wished Rob would just stop. Arthur's eyes widened. You thought? I thought Leo did it, Lydia sobbed. I thought he made the tea to protect me, to stop the fighting. I thought he used the wolfsbane from my garden book. I didn't know I didn't have any seeds. I just saw the herbs and I thought, my baby killed his father to save me. She wiped her eyes with her sleeve. So I cleaned the mug. I put it in the dishwasher. I threw away the tea bag, and when the police asked who was home, I said nothing. Because if I spoke, I might slip. I might lead them to Leo. She looked at her son, who was staring at her with wide, horrified, loving eyes. I would have died in this chair, Lydia said fiercely, before I let them take my son. The realization hit the courtroom like a physical wave. The silence wasn't arrogance. It wasn't guilt. It was the ultimate sacrifice. She had endured the media scorn, the hatred of her community, and the prospect of life in prison, all to shield her son from a crime he didn't even commit. Arthur looked at Brenda, the real killer, being handcuffed by the bailiff. Then he looked at Lydia, the woman who had taken the weight of the world on her shoulders. "Your Honor," Arthur said, his voice thick with emotion, "I think we're done here." Judge Moore wiped her own eye under her glasses. She looked at the prosecution. "Miss Ross?" Sylvia Ross stood up. She looked at Lydia with a newfound respect. She buttoned her jacket. "The people move to dismiss all charges against Lydia Kincaid with prejudice," Ross said clearly, "and we would like to file charges of first-degree murder against Brenda Walsh." "Granted," Judge Moore said, slamming the gavel down one last time. "Court is adjourned." The noise that followed was deafening. But amid the chaos of reporters shouting and people moving, Lydia didn't move. She just held out her arms, and Leo Kincaid, no longer a broken boy, but a son who finally understood, jumped the railing and collapsed into his mother's embrace. The heavy oak doors of the King County Courthouse swung open, and for the first time in 42 days, Lydia Kincaid stepped into the air as a free woman. It wasn't a triumphant exit. There were no fists pumped in the air, no cheering crowds. The atmosphere outside was a chaotic blur of flashing strobes and shouting voices, a jagged wall of noise that made Lydia flinch. The same reporters who had branded her the Ice Queen and the Black Widow of Bellevue were now shoving microphones in her face, desperate for a soundbite from the woman they had so spectacularly misjudged. Lydia, how does it feel to be vindicated? Mrs. Kincaid, did you really think your son committed the murder? Look this way. Just one smile, Lydia." She didn't smile. She couldn't. Her face felt like it had forgotten the shape of joy. She simply gripped the arm of her attorney, Arthur Penhaligon, with a strength that belied her frail frame. On her other side was Leo. Her son looked older than his 16 years, his face pale and drawn, his eyes scanning the crowd with a mixture of defiance and terror. "Keep moving," Arthur growled low in his throat, using his shoulder to barge a path through a particularly aggressive cameraman. "Don't look at them. Don't stop. Just get to the car." They reached Arthur's black sedan, and the heavy thud of the doors closing cut off the noise instantly. The silence inside the car was sudden and absolute. It was different from the silence of the courtroom, different from the silence of her cell. It was the silence of a vacuum, the quiet left behind when a tornado finally lifts back into the sky. Lydia leaned her head back against the leather seat and closed her eyes. Her hands were shaking uncontrollably. "Mum?" Leo's voice was small, cracking on the single syllable. Lydia opened her eyes and turned to him. She saw the boy she had carried, the boy she had taught to walk, the boy she had been willing to die in prison for. She reached out and touched his cheek. His skin was warm. He was real. He was safe. "It's over, Leo," she whispered. "We're going home." Leo collapsed against her, burying his face in her shoulder, sobbing with the raw, ugly intensity of a child who has held his breath for too long. Lydia held him, rocking him gently, staring out the tinted window as the city of Seattle, grey, rainy, indifferent, rolled by. The first night back in the house was the hardest. The police tape had been removed, but the adhesive residue still lined the doorframe like a scar. Inside, the house was exactly as the police had left it. There was a layer of dust on the grand piano. A half-finished architectural drawing of Rob's sat on the drafting table in the corner. The air smelled stale, trapped, preserved in the amber of tragedy. Arthur had offered to put them up in a hotel, but Lydia had refused. She needed to face the ghost. She walked into the kitchen, the crime scene, technically. This was where she had stood that night, grinding herbs. This was where she had found the mug. She stood at the counter, staring at the empty spot where the dishwasher used to be. The police had taken it as evidence. The memory washed over her with nauseating clarity. Coming downstairs, seeing the patio door open, seeing Rob floating in the pond, his shirt billowing around him like a dark jellyfish, and then the mug. The smell of wolfsbane, acrid, bitter, rising from the dregs. Leo walked in behind her. He stood in the doorway, unable to cross the threshold. "I thought you did it," he said. His voice was flat, devoid of inflection. Lydia turned slowly. "I know." "I came downstairs," Leo continued, his eyes fixed on the floor. "I saw you wiping down the counter. You looked crazy, like you were in a trance. And then the police came, and you didn't say anything. You just let them take you." He looked up, tears streaming down his face again. "Why didn't you ask me? Why didn't you just ask me if I did it?" "Because if I asked," Lydia said, her voice steady, "and the answer was yes, I would have had to lie to protect you. And I'm a terrible liar, Leo. The police would have known. But silence? Silence is truth, in a way. I couldn't lie if I didn't speak." "But I didn't do it," Leo shouted, the frustration finally boiling over. "I would never hurt him. I hated him sometimes, yeah, but I didn't kill him." "I know that now," Lydia said, crossing the room to take his hands. "But in that moment, with the wolfsbane, and the fighting, and you telling me you wished he was gone." "Leo, I'm a mother. I didn't see a crime scene. I saw my son in danger, and a mother doesn't ask questions when the house is burning. She just covers her child." Leo looked at her. Really looked at her, for the first time in months. He didn't see the Ice Queen. He saw the fiercest thing on earth. "You're crazy," he whispered, half laughing, half crying. "I'm your mother," she replied. "Same thing." 3 weeks later, the for sale sign went up in the front yard. Lydia couldn't stay. The house was too big, too full of Rob's echoing laughter and Brenda's hidden treachery. Every time she looked at the backyard, she didn't see the koi pond. She saw a grave. Packing was a slow, surgical process. Lydia threw away most of Rob's things, the bespoke suits, the architectural awards, the expensive watches. She donated them all. She didn't want the reminders. But in the bottom drawer of his desk, she found something she couldn't toss. It was a photo album, old and fraying. Inside were pictures of a younger Rob, smiling that charismatic smile that had charmed everyone, from investors to neighbors. There were pictures of him holding baby Leo, and tucked in the back, hidden behind a receipt, was a Polaroid of a baby girl. On the back, in Rob's handwriting, it said, "Veronica, 3 months." Lydia stared at the photo. This was the secret that had started the dominoes falling. If Rob hadn't hidden Veronica, he wouldn't have needed the money. If he hadn't needed the money, he wouldn't have panicked. If he hadn't panicked, he wouldn't have planned to leave. And if he hadn't planned to leave, Brenda wouldn't have killed him. It was a tragedy of errors, built on a foundation of lies. The doorbell rang, interrupting her thoughts. Lydia walked to the door, wiping dust from her hands. Through the frosted glass, she saw a silhouette. She opened it to find Veronica standing on the porch. The girl looked better than she had at the trial. Her hair was washed, her clothes were clean, and the haunted look of withdrawal was fading from her eyes. But she still looked like a frightened bird ready to take flight. "Mr. Penhaligon gave me the address," Veronica said quickly. "I can go if you want." "Come in," Lydia said, stepping back. They sat in the living room amidst the boxes. It was awkward. Here was the wife, and the secret daughter, the two women Robert Kincaid had lied to the most. "I wanted to thank you," Veronica said, picking at a loose thread on her jeans, "for paying for rehab, for not telling the police about me right away. You could have saved yourself a lot of trouble if you'd just given them my name." "You didn't kill him," Lydia said. "I wasn't going to throw you to the wolves just to save my own skin." "He talked about you," Veronica said softly, "that night, before Brenda came up. He told me he was leaving. He said he had to get away from the pressure. But he also said," she hesitated, "he said you were the only person he ever truly respected. He said you were the only thing in his life that was real." Lydia felt a pang in her chest. Not quite love, but a mournful sort of pity. Rob had destroyed everything because he didn't know how to be real. He lived in a fantasy world where he could have everything and pay for nothing. "He left us a mess, Veronica," Lydia said, "but he also left us a chance. You have your whole life ahead of you. Don't waste it being his victim. Be your own person." She handed the Polaroid to Veronica. "I think you should have this." Veronica took the photo, her eyes filling with tears. She looked at Lydia, and for a moment, the connection between them was palpable. They were both survivors of Robert Kincaid. "What are you going to do?" Veronica asked. Lydia looked around at the boxes. "We're moving to West Seattle. Smaller house, no pond, just a garden. I'm going to plant sunflowers." "Sunflowers?" They chased the light. Lydia smiled faintly. "I think I'm done with the dark." 6 months later, the new house was a modest craftsman bungalow with peeling yellow paint and a porch that creaked. But to Lydia, it was a palace. It sat on a hill overlooking the Puget Sound, where the wind smelled of salt and rain. Lydia was in the garden, kneeling in the dirt. The soil here was good, rich and dark. She was no longer the woman in the charcoal suit. She wore jeans and a muddy, oversized sweater. Her hair, once pulled back in a severe bun, was loose and blowing in the wind. Arthur Penhaligon pulled up in his vintage Mercedes. He walked up the path, holding a thick manila envelope. "Afternoon, gardener," he called out. Lydia stood up, brushing the dirt from her knees. She looked healthier. The lines of stress around her mouth had softened. "Afternoon, counsellor. To what do I owe the pleasure? Please tell me you're not billing me for this visit." Arthur chuckled. "Pro bono." "I brought the final papers. Brenda's appeal was denied. She's been transferred to the state penitentiary in Walla Walla. It's done, Lydia. Officially." Lydia took the envelope. She didn't open it. She didn't need to read the legal jargon to know it was over. "And the press?" she asked. "They've moved on," Arthur said, leaning against the porch railing. "There's a new scandal in Tacoma. Some politician. You're yesterday's news, thank God." He watched her for a moment. "You know, I still think about the trial. That moment when you pointed at Brenda. It was the most dramatic thing I've ever seen in a courtroom. But what sticks with me isn't the twist. It's the silence." "The silence?" "Most people can't handle silence," Arthur said. "They fill it with noise, with excuses, with lies. You used it like a weapon. You used it like a shield. It takes a hell of a lot of strength to say nothing when your life is on the line." Lydia looked past him, towards the Sound. A ferry was cutting through the grey water, leaving a white wake behind it. "It wasn't strength, Arthur," she said softly. "It was just love. Love is quiet sometimes. The loudest love is the kind that doesn't need to be spoken." Leo came out onto the porch then, holding 2 mugs of tea. He handed one to Arthur and one to his mother. "Earl Grey?" Arthur asked, raising an eyebrow. "Store-bought," Leo grinned. "Safe to drink?" They all laughed. It was a genuine sound, light and free. Lydia took a sip of the hot tea. It tasted like bergamot and comfort. She looked at her son, healthy and safe. She looked at the sunflowers starting to push their green heads up through the soil. She looked at the horizon. She had lost her husband. She had lost her home. She had lost her reputation. But standing there in the cool ocean breeze, Lydia Kincaid realized she had found something much more important. She had found the truth, and for the first time in a very long time, the silence around her wasn't heavy. It was peaceful, and that is where the story of Lydia Kincaid ends. Not in a prison cell, but in a garden overlooking the sea. It's a terrifying case to look back on. Think about it. Brenda Walsh destroyed 2 families because she couldn't handle rejection. She was loud. She was emotional. She was the friendly neighbor. And Lydia, the woman everyone thought was a cold-blooded psychopath because she didn't cry on cue. She was the one holding the entire world on her shoulders. It forces us to ask a really uncomfortable question about how we judge people. We look at headlines, we watch 5-second clips of courtrooms, and we decide who is guilty and who is innocent based on how they act, not on the facts. We wanted Lydia to be a villain because she didn't perform her grief for us. But while the world was screaming at her, she was silently saving her son. I want to know what you guys think. If you were in Lydia's shoes, if you thought your child had committed a terrible crime to protect you, would you have taken the fall? Would you have stayed silent? Or is that kind of sacrifice too much to ask of anyone? Let me know in the comments down below. I read through them after every upload, and I really want to hear your perspective on this one. If you enjoyed this deep dive, please do me a favor and hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow and lets me know you want more stories like this. And if you haven't already, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you'll never miss a new case. I'm Mark. This has been The Silent Verdict, and I'll see you in the next video. Stay safe, stay curious, and remember, the truth is rarely what it seems.